Our key female academics today to celebrate International Women's Day. Their research spans mind sports, children's lives in care, and insect behaviour, and they are Professor Samantha Punch, who is our Professor in Sociology, Social Policy and Criminology. We have Dr. Helen Whincup, Senior Lecturer in Social Work, and Dr. Rebecca Boulton, Lecturer in Biological and Environmental Sciences, all joining you today from the University of Stirling. My name's Kirsten Howie. I'm the Director of Development and Alumni here, and it is my pleasure to suggest we dive straight in. So, Becky, Dr. Boulton, tell us about your field. How would you describe your work, and tell us why it matters?
So I guess I kind of overlap disciplines a little bit. I was trained in evolutionary biology, which is very fundamental, sort of blue sky science, understanding how animals, particularly insects, evolved to fit into their environment. But increasingly, as I've moved forward with my career, I've found myself doing what's called applied entomology. So actually using that fundamental knowledge to improve things like in pest control. So understanding the way that insects have evolved to behave can give us really good clues as to like how we can more sustainably manage things like agricultural pests or even household pests like clothes moths.
So I think some of us are sort of instinctively think of insects and agriculture as things that shouldn't really go together. And I know a lot of your work is about aphids. What's an aphid and what are you doing to it?
So aphids are a small insect in a group called the Hemiptera. There's a lot of pests in this particular group. They have sucking mouth parts, and what they tend to do is probe into plants, and then they suck out the sort of phloem, so the juices from plants. So that makes them a really problematic pest in sort of agriculture and horticulture. So usually we think of aphids being bad. They reproduce asexually, so they can their populations can increase really rapidly, and generally they're very specialized on certain types of plants. So when you have something like a field of say broad beans, all of the aphids in that field are going to be really good at eating broad beans. So in that respect, aphids can be really problematic. But if we didn't have one big field of broad beans, maybe they wouldn't be such a problem. But what I'm really interested in is the beneficial insects, because if we've got healthy ecosystems and healthy what we call agro ecosystems, we have insects that are already present, as well as other organisms that are present that will naturally control things like aphids and protect crops. So we won't need to use things like chemicals. And the insects that I'm particularly interested in, the sort of natural enemies we call them, are parasitoid wasps. And what they do is they lay their eggs inside the aphids, and then the little baby wasp eats the aphid from the inside out, which is a little bit grisly, but they're really effective at controlling aphid populations, as well as other problematic pests like a lot of caterpillars, without needing to use harmful chemicals.
I can imagine that being eaten from the inside out really does sort of damage your ability to eat broad beans. I think the way that people think about science and has been a real driver for you, and you talk very clearly about why people need to understand more about science and how we should communicate with people. Tell us a little about your work in that area.
Yeah, so I've been doing sort of science communication and public engagement since my PhD, really. I think probably the fact that I study a group of insects that is quite, I think, unfairly sometimes maligned, the wasps, has kind of driven that. I really want people to understand that insects aren't inherently bad. Even pest insects aren't inherently bad. They're just a problem for us sometimes. And the reason that they've become a problem is how we tend to manage things. And actually sort of empowering people with the knowledge to see actually what we've done has led to these problems. And by understanding how ecosystems function and how these species have evolved, we can actually come up with ways where we don't need to sort of do so much sort of management to like farms and things. We can kind of step back a little bit and let things do what they do naturally. And I think, yeah, understanding how evolution works is really important to that. I think we've really seen in the last few years how important it is to understand how things like diseases evolve in response to, antibiotics, as well as sort of how epidemics can spread. But that also applies to things like farming. We see insecticide resistance is a massive problem. So if we use loads and loads of broad spectrum chemicals to kill insects like aphids, they very rapidly evolve resistance, much like microbes evolve resistance to antibiotics. So using an array of different strategies and things that are already there in nature is a really valuable way of reducing the amount of effort that we have to put in, and also limiting the damage that we're doing to ecosystems.
Yeah. So in your quest to help people understand that there is more than one way of doing this beyond the use of kind of broad spectrum insecticides, I understand you've come up with an unlikely ally in the person of one Taylor Swift. What's she got to do with what you do?
So Taylor Swift, something that I've been doing as part of my outreach work for quite a number of years now is I will sort of take a sort of concept and I will write about it as a song, and I'll usually rewrite the lyrics to a song. I've done various things in the past. I've done a bit of rapping, but my most recent thing, which was really trying to boost the reputation of wasps, was rewrite the lyrics to Taylor Swift's Anti-Hero from the perspective of a wasp. I thought it was a perfect song. Anti-hero, wasps to me are the ultimate anti-hero, and so it, you know, in the song I've kind of changed the words, so it's about the roles that wasps play in protecting crops, in sometimes averting famines. That's a really good example that I like to use, is actually an example from the 1990s in Western Central Africa. The cassava mealybug was a massively problematic invasive species. It colonized Africa from South America, and it had no existing natural enemies, and it was resistant to chemical pesticides. Cassava is a massively important crop. They were estimating around 4 million people could die because of a famine, just because of this pest.
Wow.
So what they did, they found a parasitoid wasp that was a natural enemy of this cassava mealybug. They bred it up, they released it, and that controlled the infestation, the outbreak. And this little wasp saved, you know, potentially 4 million people. And people don't know about that. They're tiny little wasps. People think of wasps as these big things. And so it's really about using, I guess, Taylor Swift, who is massively popular, to make something that's really unpopular, you know, maybe not popular, but just spread some awareness, I guess.
Yeah, well, I mean, if there's one person who could, you know, make wasps popular, I guess it would be Taylor Swift. But, you know, that's a really clear example of the creativity of science in challenging assumptions, which I think then brings us to some of your work, Sam. A lot of your work on Bridge is about challenging assumptions and thinking about the common assumptions of in the whole world of Bridge. Tell us what Bridge actually is. What do you do? Sam, you're muted.
Sorry, I studied the sociology of mind sport. So a mind sport is a sport that relies more on the mind than the body. So it's an intellectual pursuit. And we study in particular Bridge. And Bridge, we just use a standard pack of cards. Everyone gets 13 cards each, and you always play with a partner. So you sit opposite your partner, and you always play in pairs. So you play opposite another pair. And then basically you work together as a partnership to win tricks. So a trick is where all 4 cards have been played by each player and the highest card wins. And at the beginning, there's a little bit of a sort of complex scenario where you try and figure out what the trick target will be and how many tricks you're going to make. So we call that bidding. And people play the game for many reasons. So there's sort of the social aspects, because it's a partnership game as you're working together to solve bridge problems. But what I just described to you takes 8 minutes. So like basically every 8 minutes, there's a new mental challenge, there's a new puzzle to solve. So it's a bit like a workout for the brain.
Okay. Well, it sounds like a fascinating game, and I'm sure that it's new to some of us, although it might be familiar to many others. But what is there to study in this? What are you trying to work out about it that we don't already know?
So we've done various projects, and we're looking at the sort of how Bridge can actually address some societal challenges like well-being, healthy aging, inclusivity, social connection. But we've also looked at mind sport and gender inequalities. And I guess you wouldn't expect there necessarily to be differences between men and women in a mind sport because it's not a physical sport. But there are differences and a lot of inequalities, and that's because of social reasons rather than because of innate differences in ability. But one of the problems is that many players, men and women, both assume that men are more logical, they're more competitive, and they're less emotional. So therefore, they're better suited to bridge, and their brains are better suited to bridge. And obviously, that's not the case. So that's something that we've been trying to raise awareness about, because if you really believe that, then that's going to lead to fewer opportunities and less training for women. And women players can even end up internalizing those messages and actually believing them, and that can then affect their confidence. And if they're not confident when they're playing, that will affect their game.
Interesting. Okay, and I think a lot of this is work that you've been studying from the perspective of an insider, not just as a woman yourself, but as I understand it, an international standard bridge player. Tell us about your career as a mind sport athlete.
Yeah, so I've played bridge for now, well, certainly over 20 years. And maybe about 8 years ago, I decided to turn it into my research area, because bridge used to be my escape from work. It used to be, where I just had a clear separation between work and play. But then a few years ago, I decided that actually I could use my skills as a sociologist to perhaps make some differences in the bridge world. So, for example, the research I've told you about around gender inequality has now led to a gender policy at European level, has raised a lot of awareness, and now behaviours are beginning to change. So I sort of felt that I could do something to address some of the gender inequalities that I saw as a player, because as a female player, I was often treated unequally, and it was frustrating. So, as I said, you always play in partnership, and after a competition, people would come up to me and ask my male partner about what we did on boards and what happened and what he thought, and I would be almost invisible. And I saw that a lot. That wasn't just my experience. There was a lot of that where women players are more invisible, they're not valued for their expertise. And so I felt that there was something that could be done about that. And also in terms of raising awareness, so that, as a player, it's very hard as a female player to get really good partners or really good teammates. And in any sport, in order to get better, you have to play with and against the best. So if that's affecting your ability, to get a male partner because of assumptions that you're not going to be any good in the future because you're a woman, these kinds of things needed to be unpacked if we're going to encourage more younger women to play the game and to carry on playing the game rather than drop out because of kind of fewer opportunities compared to younger male players.
Interesting. And from our previous conversations, I gather that there's some countries in which they're teaching bridge in schools. Why is that? What do they feel it brings to the curriculum?
Yeah, so in particular, in Poland and in China, and in France, there's a definite strategy to get more bridge into the curriculum so that bridge can actually be used as an educational tool in the same way that chess is. So there's been a lot of research over the years about chess and why chess is good for children and for pupils in schools, but people don't understand that that's the same applies to bridge, except bridge offers all that chess does in terms of cognitive benefits, in terms of logical deduction and reasoning, decision making under pressure, these kinds of things. But because it's a partnership game, it also offers things like developing resilience as a partnership, emotional control, coping with setbacks together. So it's about cooperation and empathy and these kinds of soft skills that are actually quite hard to teach in schools. So it feeds into things like in Scotland, the health and well-being agendas for Scottish educational policy. It's not just about numeracy and improving mathematics.
Okay, interesting. But from what I hear, including reading about some of your work, I gather that mind sport is not simply something for younger people. Tell us about how bridge applies maybe as we're getting older.
Yeah, so bridge appeals to people across the life course because it has both these social and cognitive aspects. There's also some current research going on in Poland at the moment in neuroscience, and they're getting some good results showing that bridge can actually potentially slow down the onset of dementia. So, there's evidence that it can be good for people of all ages. I mean, healthy aging can begin in childhood. So it's good for children and young people. It helps them develop life skills, but it's also very much about lifelong learning across the life course. And it offers older people a real sense of community as they get older too.
Amazing. Okay, well, that sounds like something we should all be getting on with. If we're not already bridge players, we should be leaving this conversation and learning at the minute that we've actually finished. But for the moment, let's just pick up with what you're doing as well, Helen. Deep understanding of people's lives and unfolding circumstances is really at the centre of your work, and particularly of your major longitudinal study called Permanently Progressing. Tell us what you're doing.
Yeah, thank you. And I guess I was also interested in terms of Sam's point about women being less visible, because I guess in child welfare and protection, women are more visible. They tend to be the focus of social work interventions. So since 2014, Permanently Progressing study has been following, it's a longitudinal cohort study. So we've been following all 1,836 children who became looked after in Scotland when they were aged 5 and under in 2013, 2012, 2013. And essentially what we've been doing is looking at their routes and timeframes to permanence. And when I use the word permanence, I guess I mean two things. One is legal permanence, so somewhere where you know you're going to be somewhere, but I guess the other bit is felt permanence. So somewhere that you feel safe and loved, and permanence that extends into and beyond adulthood. So essentially what we want for all children in Scotland. And in Scotland, there are 4 routes to permanence. So the first route is remaining with or being reunified to parents, and that's what our preferred route is for children, because most children should remain with their parents. Second route is where that's not possible, being with family, so sometimes referred to as kinship care. The third route is long-term foster care, and the fourth route, and the most significant legal route, is adoption. And our study focuses on children who are living with foster carers, kinship carers, or who've been adopted. And we've been kind of following the progress at key life stages. So phase 1 ran from 2014 to 2018, so when they were tiny. Phase 2, we went back and revisited in middle childhood. And we reported in September 2024. And phase 3, which just started last month and will run to January 2030, we are going to be looking at how they're doing in adolescence, early adulthood. And it's a mixed method study. So we're drawing on administrative data, including the children looked after statistics that the Scottish Government keep on all children who are looked after in Scotland. Now that provides like the kind of big picture, but it doesn't provide what you just flagged up in terms of a deep understanding of children's lives. So we're getting that from interviews with and play and talk sessions when they were little, with children, with young people, with caregivers. In phase 2, we talked to birth parents about their experiences. We've also done surveys of social workers and caregivers and focus groups of professionals. And kind of both that breadth and depth over time has allowed us to really build up a unique understanding of the lives of young people and the people who are important to them.
I mean, this is such an important subject and so fundamental to everything that then happens in somebody's life. It always seems incredible that this is not an area where there has been more focus before. So it's interesting that you're the first study to look at so many people over such a long period of time. What sort of insights is that bringing out that were perhaps new to the field or less well understood?
I guess one of the things, so obviously in terms of lots of research, is a snapshot. So it's a snapshot of someone's life at a particular point in time. And I guess what this has allowed us to do is to kind of look at where do children go? How long does it take them to get there? Actually, I phrased that wrong, because that puts the emphasis on child, and they're not the person who's got control.
Yes.
How long does it take adults for them to secure permanence for child? and how are they getting on, and what are some of the differences. So I think it's that kind of over time that it really gives us a sense of.
Sure, because none of us exist as a snapshot, do we? I mean, we might have
Not
snapshots, but they're
usually.
not who we are. So what sort of things are you finding with regard to gender particularly? Do you find that boys and girls in this situation are having different experiences, or how is their experience shaped by perhaps the gender of the people who are looking after them?
Yeah, so I guess in terms of kind of broad picture is that kind of over time, and I guess some of the key findings have been that for all children, although the policy and the legislation about permanence is that it should be timely, our experience is that it's not been. And so on average, it's taken nearly over 2.5 years, so nearly 32 months for us to achieve permanence. And I guess in terms of what that means is that's the difference between this and this, or the difference between this and that. So that's a massive kind of time frame. So without wanting to be rude, in terms of me and Sam and Rebecca, 3 years in a big amount of time in our lives, but that's such a huge amount of time in a child's life. So in terms of gender, so that was the case across kind of all children. One of the things that we found is that kind of 10 years later, about kind of just over 10% of children were still or again in impermanent placements, which again is really shocking. And what we found was that boys were more likely to be than girls to be in impermanent placements, so their boys were disadvantaged. I guess the other key difference that we found was that in terms of who talked to us, we tended to interview more female caregivers than male caregivers, and similarly in terms of birth parents. So I'm using that term advisedly just to differentiate between parents, birth parents and adoptive parents, because most birth parents would call themselves parents. Yes. Our study was unusual because for lots of parents who've lost the care of the children, they don't have access to support, but all of the parents who talked to us did. But they tended to be mums. We spoke to one dad. So I guess there are some differences in terms of where we've got the information from in terms of gender.
Yeah. So pulling all of this together, as I suppose you're not really in a position to do yet, given that your work is ongoing, and I'm sure that you will continue to uncover new aspects of this as the children get older and grow into young adults and then older adults. How are you using this work to influence policy at this point in time? What do you hope is going to come out of this?
Okay, so I guess some things have already come out of it because it's a longitudinal study. So in phase one of the things that we found, as I mentioned, was just about the time frames to permanence. We also really importantly in phase one found that if you became looked after before you were 6 weeks old, you were far more likely to be adopted than any other form of permanence. Now, phase one reported in 2019. The 2014 national guidance had a paragraph on pre-birth assessment, and essentially what we found was that the decisions that were made before a child was born or very early in their life were really, really important. And so the revised guidance that came out in 2021 and 2023 reference permanently progressing, and it now has 16 paragraphs and flags up how significant that pre-birth period is. So I guess that's kind of one change. One of the other bits in terms of policy was just the number of children who are in impermanent placements and the timeframes, and that was flagged up in the Scottish Parliament. And as a consequence of that, the Minister for Children, Young People and the Promise said that they were funding the Association for, I always get it muddled up, Kinship, Fostering and Adoption. So it's AFCA, essentially, is the title of it. to produce a series of good practice guides. They've just been finished, so they're going to be rolled out in practice. And I guess you talked about influencing policy. I guess we really want to influence practitioners as well, because I guess one of the things that we found is that there's a gap between what legislation and policy says, for example, about siblings and what happens in practice. So it's fairly clear in the legislation and the policy that where possible, brothers and sisters should be together, and where they're not, that they should have a really important connection, and that should be supported. And what we found was that often they're not together and they don't have a connection. I teach cross social work, but primarily in terms of post-qualifying. So last week we had 80 social workers and health visitors. And one of the things that we were really focusing on is sibling connections and things that they can do to make a difference. So informing policymakers is really, really important, but also getting in touch with practitioners and with children and families.
So there's a number of things there that are going to make a real difference to children's lives, pretty much straight away, which is fantastic, I guess. The passage of time is one of those themes that I think does come out of a lot of research when we actually look at it and think about what's happening and why it's important. And Becky, I'd like to jump back to you and talk about this from the point of view of evolutionary biology again. So obviously, it's not a sport, but things are moving quite fast in some of the fields that you are studying. What does this mean about how things might be applied in the future? What's going to happen in this field?
I think that's a really good question, because we think a lot about time when we think about evolution. I think most people think evolution's really slow, it happens over millions of years, but evolution happens really fast. We saw that with COVID, we see it with antimicrobial resistance, insecticide resistance, and because it happens really quickly, it's something that we need to get ahead of. We're seeing all of these anthropogenic changes, so human-induced changes in natural environments as well as managed environments, and we need to basically support the species that are already there, that are kind of that can do our jobs for us, so the natural enemies. And so that's kind of something that we really need to understand. And there are, in terms of funding, that's something that is being looked for now. Like, how do we improve the capacity for these organisms to adapt in response to the changes that we're making to their environments? So I think that's kind of where the future's going. We've kind of already acknowledged that we need to, rather than just using chemicals, we need to manage ecosystems to sort of get these services out of the animals that are already there and the organisms that are already there. But I think now what we're starting to see is that, actually, we need to think about evolution, because it does happen quickly. It can happen within a single season. That's, one of my PhD students showed that within 5 generations, a pest species evolved to resist a natural enemy if that natural enemy wasn't able to co-evolve alongside it. Wow. So thinking about how things interact is really important, and how they evolve together when we're doing this research.
So you're basically trying to stay one step ahead of a wasp.
Yeah, or get the wasps so that they can stay one step ahead of the aphids, or whatever we want them to sort of control.
Wow, that's kind of mind-boggling. I don't even know where to go with that. Let's jump back to permanently progressing. What do you think the future or the legacy of this project is going to be, Helen? Where do you think that's going to land over time?
We are hoping, so phase 3 finishes in 2030, and we are hoping that phase 4 will start in 2032. And I guess what I hope the legacy will be is improved experiences for children and the people in their families, including their adoptive parents, foster carers, kinship carers, and birth parents. So yeah, I hope that's what the legacy is. Better services for them.
I can't get my head around next week, never mind 2032. That's feels like a long time away, and by then I'm sure I should probably have taken up bridge in order to prevent my undue premature aging. Sam, where's your work going? What's going to happen in the future? Will we all be playing bridge from the word go?
Well, we do certainly hope that more young people will be playing, and that there'll be more schools playing. We've already doubled the number of schools playing in Scotland. We hope that there'll be a much bigger focus on inclusivity and recognising that children from diverse backgrounds can play. It's particularly good for children from areas of deprivation because it's very cheap. It's great for children with neurodiversity. All genders can play. There needs to be more equality, as we've already talked about. But another thing tied into this, in order to make that happen, we think there needs to be a shift around the image of bridge and how it's seen. Because at the moment, I think the image of bridge does have some negative connotations, that either it's perhaps a bit like poker and it's gambling, and it's not, because everybody plays the same hands in bridge. So it is a game of skill. You minimize the element of luck completely because you've all got the same bridge problems. But there's also an image around that it is more of a pastime for older people, and so that's sort of shifting the image to a mind sport maybe raises its status and get people to take it a bit more seriously, not just in schools but in wider society. And academically, we'd love to see the establishment of mind sport studies. At the moment, there's leisure studies and sports studies, and mind sport studies really fits between the two. And as I said, there's already a lot of research on chess, but there's plenty more room for other research on other mind games such as Go or Mahjong even, that's played in China. Yeah, we'd like to see mind sports studies on the map, and we've already begun that at Stirling because we have the first undergraduate module for teaching the sociology of sports and mind sports here at Stirling, so that's quite fun.
Amazing. Yet another world first. And it's funny, the minute you say it, mind sports as a study, an academic field, just feels like it should be there, incredible. We've got some questions coming through on the Q&A now. So thanks so much to those of you who've submitted or upvoted questions. And I'm going to kick off with one from somebody who loves the rewording of pop songs. Becky, do you post your songs on Instagram? And if so, what's your handle? Can we follow you?
I haven't posted anything on Instagram yet, mainly because I'm not very good at Instagram. I've got a very old phone and I can't fit that many apps on it. But yes, you can follow me on Instagram. And I do have plans to increase my social media reach with some of my public engagement work when this phone dies and I get a new one. So you can follow me on Instagram. My handle is wasp_woman. Or on Blue Sky as well, I am BB-PhD.
Brilliant. There you are. You heard it here first, guys. But if you didn't catch that, then drop us a line afterwards and we will email you back with those handles of Becky so that you can follow her. Okay, so we've got a question for you, Sam. And this is all about the question of whether men are in fact more analytical and logical than women in bridge, and whether there's a generational influence to this. Is it particularly common in bridge as a sport where there's a perception of there being a lot of older people, or do you find that there's a difference in perspective that comes in with people's generations?
Yeah, absolutely. There definitely is hope for the future because there is a generational shift there. Certainly, a lot of the older players we interviewed were quite entrenched in their ways of thinking, whereas some of the younger players are beginning to think that actually, mind sports should be equality for all. So yeah, absolutely, younger players see more potential for change. But I think one of the issues is that still younger players are taught by their coaches, their captains, people that train them. Are still of the older generation. So there's still work to be done to make sure that this gender awareness training reaches all levels of the game, including tournament directors who are, organising the tournaments or adjudicating during them, and even the people on committees. Most of the committees and the executive boards of national bridge organisations tend to be dominated by men. Again, that's changing, but it is slow change, and we need to speed up the pace of change on that front. But definitely there's change with the younger generation, so that's good news. But we need to make sure that this gender awareness filters through all levels of the game.
Yeah, I've got another interesting question here for you, Sam. Just continuing to look at the impact of gender and bridge. This question brings in the question of diet. Do you know of any research on the impact of diet on bridge performance, or any gendered differences around how your diet would affect this? I guess we'd all like to know that. How can I be thinking more clearly by eating better?
Absolutely, diet definitely affects performance at top levels. So we did do another project on elite level bridge, and we've written a paper around the physicality of elite level bridge, because although it is mostly a mind sport, it does take a toll on the body, because at the very top, tournaments can be 8 hours a day for 2 weeks. So you need to build up a lot of physical stamina in order to be able to play. And of course, nutrition's part of that. If you're playing 8 hours in a day, you need to have the right kinds of snacks at the table, nuts and bananas, rather than sugary sweets, because otherwise you'll get those sugary spikes, and that will affect perhaps your bidding judgment at the table. So absolutely, diet's important. And there's greater recognition of that now. Gradually, Bridge is starting to see that we need things like sports psychologists and coaches that think about the holistic perspective of the game, not just about what cards you play and how you play them. It's about, you know, are you fit enough to have the stamina and the resilience? Is your diet good enough? You know, are you eating a lot of blueberries that are good for the brain to, you know, to help your concentration? Because, you know, concentrating on and off for 8 hours a day is quite a big ask at top levels.
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, it's slightly terrifying that now there's yet another reason to put down the biscuits, isn't there? It might impair my judgment. Okay, never mind. Helen, I want to turn to you now and ask whether, in fact, it's true that there's more adoptive parents giving their adopted children back to the care system, or is that just something that we're now hearing about as a problem more often? Is this a real trend right now?
I guess one of the difficulties is that it's really difficult to establish that. Currently, the statistics that are collected on children who become looked after, there's nowhere in that says this child was previously adopted. So it's really difficult to tell. I guess there has been there's been some recent programmes on the BBC that the question might be referring to. So there's more of a focus on it now, and I guess one of the things that we are more aware of is just the ongoing support. So adoption is lifelong. It's got lifelong implications for children, for birth parents, and for adoptive parents and all of their families. And I guess historically, what used to happen was that children and their families didn't necessarily get lifelong support. And one of the things that we found is that for lots of adoptive families, it can feel lonely, and it can feel isolating. So I guess there's been much more of a focus recently on the ongoing support that's needed to help children and their families throughout. But so the answer is that it's the statistics aren't that reliable, is the answer.
That's interesting, and I mean, one never wants to hear of placements breaking down, but I want to link this to another question that's just come through here, Helen. What can everyday people do to support or better understand children in care, and I guess their wider networks, including adoptive parents or foster placements and so on?
Oh, that's a lovely question. Thank you for that. I guess a while ago, and I think it was 2004 now, there was a document that said it's everyone's job to make sure I'm all right. And I guess just to have that sensitivity that when you meet a child and they've experienced difficult stuff, that might come up in any number of ways. And I guess just to treat people with empathy and care as you would like to be treated yourself.
You want to tell us a little, Helen? I was really struck when we spoke previously about your small acts of kindness.
Yeah.
Do you want to tell us about that?
Yeah, I guess one of the things that we found throughout each of the phases, and it was a real message of hope, was that ostensibly small acts made a real difference. They made a real difference to children, to parents who'd lost their children to care, to caregivers, and conversely, where people were not sensitive, that also made a real difference. So where they might be disrespectful or label either children or adults, that made a difference. So I think ostensibly small acts of kindness make a real difference.
Okay. All right, so it's probably not too little just to do a nice kind thing or offer a banana or point somebody towards a bridge game, which brings us back to bridge. I have a practical question here, Sam. Are there online networks where people could try playing bridge, or is this an in-person only occupation?
No, absolutely. There's always been online bridge, but of course this exploded during COVID. So the whole game shifted online, and it was amazing to see that there were some people, for example, in the 80s who bought a computer for the first time just so that they could carry on playing bridge. And of course, there were ongoing benefits of that in terms of family Zooms and then being able to buy things online as well. So they learned to become digitally literate just because of bridge, but then that affected the rest of their lives. So that has continued. I mean, obviously COVID has shaped the future of bridge as well forever. I mean, there are now more online competitions, and there's obviously a bigger upside of that. And there is a generational difference there, because for older people, it's great that if they are having some sort of health issues and they can't get out and about, they can still play their regular club game online and still meet their friends online. And also during COVID, an English bridge player, developed Real Bridge, which is a version of, it's an online platform where you can have video as well, so you can see and speak to your opponents as you play. So it kind of mirrors the social kind of aspect of real life bridge. But obviously, having said that, it's never quite the same playing online, because it's not quite as social. Even though, yeah, you can see people online, it's not the same as having that social connection in person. And interestingly, our current research shows that young people prefer face-to-face bridge rather than online. They'll play online if they have to, in terms of practicing, or if their partner lives at a distance, or to sort of, keep things ticking along in the meantime. But when it comes to actually playing tournaments, they don't want to play tournaments online. They want to be face to face. They want to have fun with their friends. They want to meet up, and you can't have as much fun through a screen. So they're actually the ones pushing for more face-to-face activities for bridge and young people. And some older people, are actually appreciating the fact that they maybe don't have to drive at night to go to their bridge club. But we found that actually now having hybrid and having both options is the best way to go. But ultimately, I think most bridge players, at least I think 90% or so, would say that face-to-face is better for the social part of bridge.
So it's possible, and it's a good second best if that's where you need to go to. Has the Polish research that you mentioned about bridge delaying the impact of dementia actually been published?
Well, there's a website about their work. It's called Bridge to the People Foundation, and they actually have an online conference about this tomorrow, and it will be live on YouTube. So I can provide the link if people are interested in following that up. There'll also be a recording of it afterwards, but they do have some of their reports on their website.
Brilliant, thank you. So we'll get the link out there to all those of you who are interested in this. Becky, I want to jump back to you and ask how you feel being a woman in your field affects anything at all. Helen and Sam have both spoken about this. You've focused more on aphids and insects. Do you think being a woman affects how you do what you do, or anything else in your field, or is it frankly just irrelevant?
No, I think it's really a really important thing. And I think something that sort of like side quest that I've been on for a while is understanding how, the field that I work in has been impacted by increasingly diverse sort of scholarly community. We've seen, kind of looking to birds, we've seen how research on birds has been shaped by female researchers and women researchers. So there was kind of a long-held assumption that female birds don't really sing. And that was kind of what everyone thought was the case. But there's been a really nice study recently showing that sort of women researchers have kind of turned that on its head. Birds sing, female birds sing, male birds sing. And it's because of the contributions of women in my field that have sort of shown that. And I think that's the case as well. A lot of my research is kind of looking at sort of how insects make mating decisions, because that has implications for the way that they evolve. And that's a big field where we've seen big shifts in kind of the general ideas. The idea that we have sort of sexual selection, we have males that have these elaborate traits and they fight and they're active, and females are passive and they just kind of don't do anything. And that came from Darwin. That was, you know, something that came up in Victorian times. But we know now, and I think it's in part because of all of the women that are doing this research and kind of have sort of looking at some of these assumptions with a more critical eye, as well as having really good tools that show actually female animals are not passive. They are active, they make choices, they mate multiply, and sexual selection acts on females. It's just less obvious. And I think it's taken those sort of insights and the more diverse experiences of the research community to overturn and challenge those assumptions. So yeah, I think being a woman in my field is really important to have women in my field, and it's also really important that we have researchers from different backgrounds, not just increasing gender diversity, but having a diverse range of experiences is really key for you know, overturning and challenging assumptions in all scientific disciplines, including mine in evolutionary biology.
Okay, great. So there's more diversity coming in our future, and we're learning to value that more, which I think is a really positive message for all of us to celebrate International Women's Day. But before we leave the Q&A, I want to ask all of you the same question. Is there a woman out there who's inspired you, or a female role model that you'd like to share with us today? Do you want to jump in first, Becky?
Yeah, sure. That's really difficult because there are so many women who have been really influential in my scientific career, but I guess like the first one is my mum, who is a scientist in her own right, but has like always encouraged me to kind of follow my sort of scientific passion and my creativity. You know, she was a metallurgist in the 1970s when she was the only woman working then, and she, you know, she kept doing it. It was a very male dominated field, and then she went and did something else because she was like, I'm going to go and have kids now, and that's, you know, the decision I want to make, but then I'm going to go back to work and do something different. And I think, yeah, the way that she has kind of sort of the decisions that she's made has kind of allowed me to see, actually, I just have to follow my science and follow the thing that makes sense to me and that I'm passionate about. So yeah, I guess my mum.
Awesome. That's really nice. Helen, what about you? Tell us about a woman who's inspired you.
Again, so many. I was swimming this morning trying to think about women who hadn't inspired me rather than one, because I was thinking, who should I say? And I was thinking, well, if I say so and so and so and so and so and so, then so and so and so and so and so and so, I'm going to get a huff because I didn't mention them. So yeah, I guess as I was swimming, there's a woman who is 85 and has been swimming every day that I've been there for the last 20 years. And a guy got in this morning, made a big fuss about jumping in, swam, displaced lots of water. She was just swimming up and down. And I thought that was inspiring, just continuing with persistence. And yeah, she's persistent. And I just thought that persistence and unflappability was really inspiring. So lots of women in academia have inspired me in terms of being collegiate and thoughtful and caring. So yeah, difficult to name one.
Yeah, I can imagine. Okay, Sam, so the difficult question is now coming your way. Can you think of one woman you'd like to share with us who's inspired you?
Yeah, well, the woman that springs to mind is Sabine Auken. She's a German bridge player, and of course that won't mean anything to anyone, because one of the problems with bridge is we don't have celebrities that are known out with our world. Our bridge celebrities are only famous to us as players, and so we really need to get, obviously, Taylor Swift playing bridge. That would be the best thing we could ever do for bridge. But the reason I would pick Sabine is because she really believes in equality at the bridge table, and she's shown it in her actions. So she now doesn't play women's bridge. She only plays in open bridge fields, and she's reached the highest levels and world championship level in the open field. So she's shown that, you know, the stereotypes about women can't be as good as men are not necessarily the case. So she's kind of leading by example, and we need more, you know, role models in bridge to show that, you know, there can be a different way of doing things. And she also very much supports youth bridge and things like youth camps. And that even reminds me that we do have a youth camp at Stirling University this summer in June. And that's open to everyone. It focuses particularly on 10 to 26-year-olds, but we also have an adult learners section as well. So if anybody is interested and wants to come and learn in a face-to-face environment on campus, then they'd be very welcome.
Fantastic. Well, that then reminds me to point out that we have had a couple of questions about sharing links and whether your friends can access this presentation afterwards. We'll make sure we get some information round to all of you guys watching after the session so that you can find out more about how to get involved and so that you can follow up the links at your own leisure. I'm sure there'll be plenty for most of us to pick up. And I think the thing that makes me reflective right now is I've just heard all three of you say pretty much the same thing, actually, which is that there are people out there who decide what they're interested in, decide that they're going to follow it through, and then inspire the rest of us in doing it and in achieving what they're going to achieve. That's a really great message, I think, to all of us this International Women's Day, and that's what I think I'll take away with me after this conversation. But I do want to wind things up now because I'm conscious that all of you have got work to get back to and more knowledge to uncover and share with all of us. I think we recognise the breadth of the challenges that we face globally, but also the depth of the expertise that we are lucky enough to have working on them from multiple angles and, of course, in multiple places, but of course with Stirling amongst them. And we know that we've only just scratched the surface of some of these really rich and important topics. And the conversations don't end here. So as I say, we'll share the follow-up links to our speakers' research on the screen and with a follow-up email so that you can have a look at this. If you want to support our students or our researchers, then just get in touch. We'd love to hear from you and we can talk you through the options there. For our alumni and for friends of the university, please do make sure that your details are up to date with us so that you don't miss any invitations to upcoming events. Again, we'll make sure that all the links are there and they'll be on the screen right now. And if you've got any feedback, then share that with us. Did you enjoy this? Does this work for you? What kind of events or conversations would you like to hear from us next? We're keen to do more and make sure that we're there for our alumni and supporter community. And your input is going to help us shape whatever it is that we do next. However, at this point, I just need to say a really big thank you to all of our speakers, Professor Samantha Punch, Dr. Helen Whincup, and Dr. Rebecca Boulton. Thank you so much for joining us, guys. I realise that you do have jobs to do, and I'm really grateful for your time and for everything you've so generously shared with us today. And thanks to all of you watching for joining us and for being part of this International Women's Day conversation. We hope to see you again at future events. Have a great rest of your day, wherever you are. Goodbye.